Okay, today, let's start with the word of prayer. Father, we thank you for this day. We pray that you will give us ears to hear, hearts and minds to understand, and pray that you'll use this, what we have to talk about today, to your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, today I'm going to talk about knotty problems. When I start preparing one of these updates, usually everything is in a nice, neat order, sort of like a line. Or like when you get new headphones and you take them out of the box. Remember, how beautiful that line is and how nicely they're wound together. And it doesn't take very long for your headphones to end up like this. So like, I had these wound up very nicely this morning, my headphones, and I put them in my pocket. I haven't touched them till now, and you can see they're a mess. And this is what happens to my prophecy update presentation, is it looks great, and then I keep working on it, and it seems like I haven't done anything to it, and all of a sudden, it's a big mess. Because we live in a world where, because of all of the different things that are converging, all of the things that are going on, that things are turned into this knot. Actually, on the headphone thing, there was actually a guy who did a scientific paper that was published in a scientific journal back in 2006 about the physics involved in headphone knots. This man is a genius. Now, I don't know what his conclusion was. I think his conclusion might be, it happens. And we know that it does happen because it happens to me all the time. And I don't know how to stop it. So as we get closer to the end, and I have made this point many times before, I believe that we're going to see even knottier problems than we have now. That as all of these different lines of Bible prophecy, all of these different themes of Bible prophecy, as we get closer to the return of the Lord, they're going to converge. And as they converge, they create almost like a vortex, like in a tornado and a windstorm, and it can be very, very turbulent. And so I only say that to just, I don't think I need to point that out to you if you're paying attention at all. You know that this is exactly what is happening. And this is what happens to my updates each week as we live in, and again, I've been using this for years because I think that even secular people know something is going on. Now, let me just give you a few Bible verses to kind of put things into a little bit of a context. I did a series, and somebody asked me about this, where if it was available someplace, and the answer is no, I don't think it is. I did a series called Famous Last Words, and I looked at things that people said when they knew they were at the end of their lives. I looked at Moses, I looked at Joshua, I looked at Jesus, and I looked at Paul. Because Paul knew he was going to die. In fact, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, the last thing that Paul ever wrote, he says this, "For now I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand." He knew that his time on earth was coming to an end. He knew that he was going to be executed by the Romans at some point. And so it always occurs to me is that, and in fact, in the law, as a trial lawyer, one of the things that you're not usually allowed to introduce hearsay into a court proceeding. Now, if you're a Democrat in an impeachment inquiry, you're allowed to do anything goes. But in a court proceeding, we have rules of evidence that say generally an out-of-court statement is not admissible. Now, there are probably 20-some exceptions to that rule, one of which is, by the way, a dying declaration. Because you figure when people are laying there on the ground, dying and ready to meet their maker, they're probably going to tell you something that is accurate. And so they're not likely to be telling a big whopper when they're getting ready to die. So this is, I think, what is important. So Paul talks about this. My departure, time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them also that love his appearing. And in leading up to that, his statement there, he had written some, I think, very important words that sort of indicate the time and the days in which we live. This know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good. Could we maybe turn that fan just a little bit more towards the center? Because I think it might be what's causing me to a bit, because I haven't coughed all morning hardly. So he talks about these people. They are led away with divers lusts, ever learning and never able to come to knowledge of the truth. Now as Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses, so do these also resist the truth. Men of corrupt minds reprobate concerning the faith. But they shall proceed no further, for their folly shall be manifest unto all men, as theirs also was. And then in chapter 4, at the beginning of chapter 4, Paul gives this instruction to Timothy. Preach the word, be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all longsuffering and doctrine. For the time shall come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears, and they shall turn away their ears from the truth, and shall be turned unto fables. Now, just a couple updates. We see these things happening all over the world. This is a picture, let me go back and do that again, it's a very short video, of wildfires in Australia. And we see these things happening all over the place, catastrophic fire damage. We know that things were happening in California. And in California, they've been shutting off the power to hundreds of thousands, even millions of people at a time. And one of the problems is when they do that, the cell phone towers don't work either. And this, I think this is a picture of some of the things that might be coming in different places around the world as we have problems with power grids. This is a big concern. I'll talk a little bit about concern about the power grid in Israel, about what would happen and how relatively easy it would be to take out the power grid in Israel with a few missiles. Same here, or an EMP blast. And this is true, but this is true almost everywhere in the world, that this would happen. But before I get there, I want to talk about this because I think this is one of the more important Christian-related stories that I saw this week. At Religion News Service, they reported about an organization called Neighborly Faith. They had a meeting at Wheaton University called Neighborly Faith urges evangelicals to find a third way to befriend Muslims. Now, this is something I know Pastor Steve and I have had a concern about for a long time, are these interfaith dialogues. And I want you to listen to some of the things that were said in this article talking about this event at Wheaton University about interfaith dialogue, and the ultimate question will be, who is evangelizing who in these things? So here's what the head of this, the guy who started this, his name is Matthew Kamink, professor of Christian ethics at Fuller Evangelical Seminary, and author of Christian Hospitality and Muslim Immigration in an Age of Fear. Now, you can kind of get an idea where he's coming from. But he said this, he's quoted this in the article, Muslims are not a mission or a project that you work on like a science experiment or something. One of the people that was a backer of this was a guy named Daniel Darling, and some other people, former Southern Baptist pastors and that sort of thing, who are pushing this interfaith dialogue with Muslims. Personally, I have never seen anything good come out of these in terms of advancement of the gospel of Jesus Christ. But listen, here's a quote on, and again, this guy is Vice President, Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. We cannot obey Jesus if we spread false ideas about our Muslim neighbors or if we fail to love them well. That's why I appreciate the work of Neighborly Faith that helps believers understand the Muslim community and equips them with tools to help them fulfill the mission of God. Now, wait a minute. Does that make, am I reading that correctly? It sounds like we meet with Muslims and equip them with tools to help them fulfill the mission of God. It sounds like we're going to equip Muslims to do this. Now, listen, I can dig back into my archives, and this has been something that happened a long, long time ago. It was very controversial. The Orange County Register came out and said, oh, Rick Warren was promoting Islam. And of course, there were denials and everything, and people took things down. But I do have a pretty extensive file of tweets and emails or communications between a pastor at Saddleback, where Rick Warren is the senior pastor, and Muslim people in the community about, hey, are you using purpose-driven life to help you in your community? It was not about, is purpose-driven life helping you come to a proper knowledge of God and Jesus Christ? It was, are you able to use the purpose-driven life to further your mission to spread Islam? And that's exactly what it's, to me, this is what this quote is saying, and correct me if I'm wrong. One person that was at this, Shadi Hamid, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, he was at this meeting, addressed whether Christians and Muslims can befriend. It is something I believe is not just possible, but it'd be pretty great, said Hamid, who is Muslim. So here's a Muslim guy, he works at the Brookings Institution, and he's saying, I just don't think it's possible for Christians and Muslims to really be friends, but let's give it a shot. He pointed to his own friendship with Kamig, who opened the conference. There's a strong theological component where we learn from each other's theologies and faith convictions, and I found that to be very fulfilling. At least in his friendships with evangelicals, Hamid says he doesn't feel as though he's being evangelized. Okay. And he isn't worried about being overwhelmed by evangelicals who outnumber Muslims in the U.S. wanting to befriend Muslims. That doesn't sound terrible to me, especially when, what? My views about God are never going to be challenged. And you need to understand, this is a huge philosophical issue with the way missions and evangelism are done or not done today. There is a, what was it called? The C5 contextualization movement. And what it said essentially was, you Christians, we're going to come and evangelize you, but if you're a Muslim and you want to believe in Jesus, you can stay as practicing Muslim. You can go to mosque, you can do the prayers, say the, whatever that phrase is that they say, there's only one God and Muhammad is his prophet. You can do all of that and still be a Christian in your Muslim context or a follower of Christ. And this, in my view, eviscerates the gospel. And there were a whole host of organizations that grew up to promote this kind of nonsense, in my view, just absolute nonsense. So he goes on, Singer, this is a guy who was at this conference. He is a former Southern Baptist pastor who's big on this. And he said this is from the article. Singer said he hopes that a family conversation, as well as the opportunity to meet and hear from Muslims, will help change the attitudes of the evangelicals who attended the conference. An anonymous survey of attendees conducted by Neighborly Faith after the events suggests that they may have. And in the article, they cite a website about Muslims that I don't know who funded it, but I suspect that it's funded by CARE or Soros or one of his organizations. And they were talking about how Americans misunderstand what Islam is all about. And so they welcome these interfaith dialogues because they want to educate evangelicals, and maybe evangelicals who get into this stuff really need to stop using the term evangelical. And they're eviscerating, in my view, the gospel. So listen to this. Of those who identified as conservative evangelical students who went to this conference, 49% had neutral or somewhat negative attitudes towards Muslims coming into the conference, Singer said. Afterward, only 6% remained neutral and none maintained a negative attitude towards Muslims. So I repeat the question that I asked when I started down this little path. Who was evangelizing who at this event? And the article concludes with, that means 94% left the conference with either somewhat positive or very positive attitudes towards Muslims. And just let me suggest that a follow-up survey of the Muslims who attended that conference would show that 0% accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. I'm very confident that that was the case. And so this is what passes. I could go on. There are things coming into the church through critical race theory. Everything is viewed through power structures. It's Marxism. And this is being adopted by Crew and other organizations. It's becoming endemic in seminaries all over America. And I don't even have time to go into it, but all of this stuff is eviscerating the Gospels. This is part, in my view, this is part of the what is feeding the apostasy of the last days. So if you want to use an analogy to is apostasy growing, what's happening in Australia with the fires is exactly what's happening with apostasy today, because it's growing and it's burning down the church in many respects. Now, another thing that I want to talk about is the attack on free speech, because I think this is what ultimately will be part of what leads to persecution of Christians. So this is maybe a little bit technical, but I want you to understand how these things happen. Now, this is an article from Foreign Policy. Germany's online crackdowns inspire the world's dictators. Now, in the article, it says, now look, Germany cracked down on things that were happening online, and they didn't intend for this to happen, but now totalitarians and dictators all over the world are using the German law that was enacted back in 2016 or 2015 as a template to restrict free speech and crack down on people expressing their views online. Wait, I'm sorry. So 30 years, we celebrated this week, 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Germany now is back leading the charge, if you will, innocently or not, I don't really care. The fact is they're leading the charge to crack down on free speech. This is having an impact. Some of the groups that I belong to on Facebook, where I might be an administrator, have received notice that a couple people from that are in your group posted fake news, and happens again, we're closing your group. Some of these groups have thousands of people that follow what's posted there. Now, the interesting thing is when you inquire exactly what was it that this person posted that isn't acceptable or doesn't meet Facebook's community standards, you get no response from Facebook. It's the most opaque organization I think I may have ever dealt with in my life, and I've dealt with some pretty, in litigation, people trying to hide things from you. So I've never seen anything like it in my life. And this is what's happening. So back in 2016, I think it was, 2017, the Act to Improve Enforcement of the Law in Social Networks. Now, there were people that came out, it was called the Network Enforcement Act. The detractors of the thing argued that it delegates to the private sector the role of cyber cop and little transparency or due process. This encourages social media companies to over-implement by providing an incentive to err on the side of caution to avoid fines. And what happens is, even though it was enacted in the EU, and there was a recent court decision or decision of some European panel on judges that said, look, you have to take down this offensive comment that somebody made about somebody worldwide. So what happens in the EU doesn't stay in the EU, it's being implemented all around the world. And the social media companies are going to go, well, we're going to follow the most restrictive thing. And so these platforms which use the internet, which is sort of a public, in my view, a public utility, and they use the internet in some respects for at least the communication infrastructure that's been put up for free. And in a sense, I think they are like a public utility, but nevertheless, they say, oh, well, we're just a private company. We can do whatever we want. So this is going to be difficult. Now, one of the things that was included in this act, the Network Enforcement Act in Germany, included Germany's approach to the offense of defamation of religions, which violates international human rights standards. Now, there are laws in place that guarantee freedom of religion. I've mentioned this a number of times before. The problem is that the European view of freedom of religion is very, very different from the American view of the free exercise of religion. So in Europe, they will say, well, certainly you have the right to your personal religious opinions and views. And nobody should be able to force you to change that. But the problem is that good at directing this right into the mic to blow out the headphones and stuff of the sound people. But so you have a right to your belief, but you don't have a right to express it. So look at how this writes. This is from Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and it says, everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority, regardless of frontiers. Part 2, the exercise of these freedoms may be subject to formalities, conditions, restrictions, or penalties as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society. So what the EU gods give in Part 1, they take away in Part 2, and it says, in the interest of national security, territorial integrity, or public safety, for the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, for protection of health or morals, for the protection of the reputation or rights of others, for preventing the disclosure of information received in confidence, or for the maintaining of the authority and partiality of the judiciary. In other words, you may think you have the right to free expression, but it's subject to what we think how it should be limited. Now, this is very different from the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution, which says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging freedom of speech or of the press. Now listen, this is what things like the Equality Act that the Democrats want to put into law and Joe Biden has said, if I'm president, the first thing I'm going to pass is the Equality Act. He said that at a human rights thing here in Columbus, Ohio, a few months ago. And you know what? I believe him. It's passed Congress. It won't get out of a Republican Senate, but if it did get out of a Republican Senate, folks, do you think that we have 51 solid Republicans that wouldn't vote for that stuff? I'm not convinced that we do. And then it would go to the president, and the president may be tied up in like impeachment proceedings or something like that. So I'm very concerned about it. And what that act does is there was an act enacted under the Clinton administration 20-some years ago, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and said, look, people have a right to exercise their freedom of religion. And the Equality Act says that act has nothing to do with what we're trying to enact here. It doesn't apply. In other words, we don't care what this says. And you know how this is going to be used. So this is back to the article on foreign policy. Several laws or proposals we identified, including in the UK and India, don't merely rely on notification and takedown regime. They establish a duty of care requiring intermediates, like social media companies, to actively police and preventively remove illegal or undesirable content. And so a group involving Christians and conservatives on Facebook is now at risk of being taken down because of stuff like this. So it's not a hypothetical any longer. It's the actual reality. Foreign policy article says this essentially poses the risk of reintroducing government-mandated pre-publication censorship enforced by private tech companies. And this was something that was not done for a long time. But in the digital age, censorship may ultimately be able to search and destroy undesirable content at a scale previously unimaginable. Let me just back up for just a minute. Foreign policy is not a conservative publication. Now, it has conservatives who write for it, and I read it pretty regularly because it gives me sort of a broad spectrum of views on foreign policy and that type of thing. But you see this happening in practical ways. In the UK, this is from the Daily Mail or the Guardian recently, theaters drop use of ladies and gentlemen. Air Canada has announced they will no longer make announcements, ladies and gentlemen, please sit down and fasten your seatbelt. Because it might offend that small slice of society that doesn't believe they are either ladies or gentlemen. And this is what's controlling the speech now. This is an act that was put in place just recently by the state of New York, an act to amend the tax law in relation to limitations on political activity. And essentially it says this: we're going to enforce the Johnson Amendment 501c3 on nonprofits, religious organizations in the state of New York, and take away their tax exemption, at least in the state of New York, if they engage in any political activity. Now, do you think this is going to apply to every church equally? You know that it won't. But there's a concerted effort to shut down opposing voices in America. It's happening all over the world. It's even happening here where we have things like the First Amendment. So I just want to say, with regard to back up just a minute to this discussion about interfaith dialogues, I can show you, I would be willing to bet on that interfaith dialogue at Wheaton University, that if you went to the blogs of some of the Muslims or Twitter accounts or social media accounts of the Muslims that attended that interfaith dialogue, some of them would say, it was great that we had the opportunity to go and instruct evangelicals and teach them and evangelize them about the wonders of Islam. Because I know, and Steve, you know this to be true, in the past, that's exactly what has happened in these interfaith dialogues with people who maybe with the best of intentions went there, but the road to hockey stick is paved with good intentions, as they say. So this is a problem. With regard to this New York Act, one of the senators said this is a simple bill that serves an important purpose, to keep in place standards we have had in this country for over 60 years that shield not-for-profits and houses of worship from political entanglement. So there's a good way to shield houses of worship from political entanglement, and that is, I would say this to Senator Liz Krueger, leave them alone. Get out. So and this is a myth. So there's a lot of controversy about this amendment. And I don't really have time to go into this, but this is an interesting article in Harvard Magazine written by Sarah Richardson. She's a professor at Harvard. She now has tenure. She did some research recently about sex and gender, looking for sex, gender in the human genome. And she's into a thing called epigenetics. Again, I don't have time to go into that, but essentially it's a way that people in science are getting around the empirical evidence that they come up with. They sort of adopt this philosophical approach that comes out of epigenetics and says, well, we have to interpret the data in a way that makes sense to us. And this is what's happening. I mean, this is a quote from the article. The tradition that I come from suggests that all science is social, that we use the resources around us to reason about the world. Science is not motivated solely by either empirical reasoning or gendered bias. Now look, if I buy a car and the car has a brake system designed so that I don't run into the back of a semi-trailer when I'm driving down the road because I put on the brakes and it actually, I don't want somebody worrying about gender bias when they're making those calculations as to how to design that car and the brake system. But this is what's happening. Do you see that what's happening is we are creating all of these knotty problems. Dennis Prager was on Bill Maher last week. I didn't have time to pull the clip. In that they were talking about, they said, well, Dennis, do you believe that President Trump lies? And Dennis Prager said, yeah, I think President Trump lies. But the left, he said, lies about really, really big things, like men can menstruate. And everybody on the panel, all of whom were, except maybe one guy who seemed to be sort of center-oriented, everybody else was left-wing. And they looked at him like, Dennis, you're making it up. You're unreasonable. Nobody has said that. And he said, go Google it. Men can menstruate. You have men setting records in women track events. And he said, the University of California at Berkeley has tampon dispensers in the men's restrooms. This is a fact. This is established fact. And they all looked at him like, you're crazy. Now, when he was talking about it on a show later this week, Dennis said, listen, we have a problem because we don't even agree on reality. And we cannot communicate with each other. Now, if you're on social media, you know this to be the case. So this is a problem. This is a problem, too. Experts fear deep fake videos could upend an election. And we've talked about this in the past. This is from the front page of the LA Times. Again, not a conservative publication. So secular people are seeing this, and nobody really knows what to do about it, because as soon as somebody comes up with a way to recognize a fake video, inevitably what will happen is the people who make the fake videos will adjust their programs and algorithms to eliminate that particular problem. Might be the blink rate on the eyes or something like that. To say, oh, well, look, you can tell that's a fake video because the blink rate on the eyes is not right. And then all of a sudden here comes a video along with the blink rate corrected, and nobody can tell anything. And to me, this is one of the more scary things that's happening. So the videos on Fellowship Bible Chapel are not fake. That's me. That's Pastor Steve and Mike and everybody else. But other channels I can't vouch for. And I've seen people take stuff and chop it up, even of me and some others, and it's I'm not sure what sin that is, but it's definitely sin. And if you see somebody doing that, they should stop it. We're about the truth here, and people who do that sort of thing are not. So avoid them. If you catch somebody doing it, never listen to them again. That's a pretty simple thing. So this is an article from a Russian website. Russia's warnings worked. Israel does not bomb Syria even against Iran's threats. It says this, Israel decided not to test the effectiveness, by the way, now I'm going to shift to the Middle East, and some things are going on in geopolitics for the rest of my little talk today. Israel decided not to test the effectiveness of Russian S-300 and S-400. Until recently, Israel has been quite active in striking neighboring Syria, justifying those attacks with the elimination of pro-Iranian military units which supposedly pose a threat. However, after the meeting between the Russian president and the Russian Israeli prime minister, during which, according to media reports, Putin threatened Netanyahu with radical measures, and the event of continued aggression against Damascus, there were no more Israeli attacks on the Arab Republic. Quote from someone involved in this, until recently, Israel actively bombed Syria, even after a series of high-profile statements by Tel Aviv about the readiness of Iranian military forces to launch dozens of cruise missiles from Syria and Israel. Netanyahu has not taken any measures against Syria. It is logical to assume that the warnings of Russia did work, and Israel does not really want to check the effectiveness of air defense systems that can shoot down fighters with a radius of about 400 kilometers. So this is an issue that needs to be watched because we know there's this tension in the Middle East, and people are against Israel, and they want to eliminate the Jewish state of Israel, and there are a lot of pressures on Israel right now. Now, one of the things we often talk about in Bible prophecies is Ezekiel 38 and 39. My personal view is that Ezekiel 38 and 39 is not imminent. I don't think it's happening this week. I think it's something certainly to watch as the alliances get put in place and that sort of thing. But there's a lot of logistics involved, and how quickly they could assemble a great company and a mighty army to come against Israel is questionable. People say, oh, what can happen in a week? You know, just get a bunch of Toyota pickup trucks and drive everybody there. But I don't know that that's necessarily true. They can commandeer airlines, I know that. But you don't just put troops there, you have to put, supply lines and all that sort of thing. So, for example, when we, one of the Iraqi wars, back the Kuwait war, it took us 6 months to assemble all of our gear and military and that type of thing. So I think it's going to happen. But other things that aren't in place yet are some of the alliances that I think need to be formed. But here's an interesting article from the New York Times, also was in the Washington Post this week, about mission muscles into Libyan war. And what is happening is Putin is reaching into Libya now and making alliance with one of the sides in the Libyan civil war that's been raging since Gaddafi was killed, 6-7 years ago. The country is very divided, has great oil resources. It's only a few hundred miles from the coast of Italy, the northern coast of Libya. So, and Libya itself is a country it's a pretty big country. I believe it's either 3 times or 5 times the size of Texas. So it's pretty big place. As you know, Texas is pretty big. It's a thing that I think you should watch for, is this development of alliance between Russia and other parties that are involved in the Gog-Magog war. These things seem to be coming together. And Russia's also doing things in Sudan. We know that there's a looming war, really, between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt over a giant dam that Ethiopia is building that will, as it fills the reservoir behind the dam, will severely restrict the flow of water in the Nile River. That will have devastating impact if it happens. It's not controlled. And so they've made really not much progress on trying to get that situation worked out. Ethiopia says, well, wait a minute, the rain falls here, the water comes from here. The major source of the water source is the Blue Nile that forms the Nile River along with the White Nile. That's here in our country. We need to use the water because, well, we live in a desert. And this is something that we have water that we can use to develop things. And why should Egypt get to control what we need to survive? And these water problems are looming all over the country. So in this video, Ayatollah Khamenei spoke to a group of students. He said this, essentially it says this, essentially we have the United States cornered. We have them right where we want them. They may say that they're doing well, but they've done all these hostile actions, they've done these things, and we're doing okay. Now, one of the things that you have to watch with regard to everything coming out of the Middle East is the tremendous amount of propaganda that comes. I showed you an example last week from the Daily Sabah, which is Erdogan's mouthpiece, talking about the Kurds had to be terrorists because they provided information on where al-Baghdadi was. So that proved that they knew where the terrorism was and that they are part of ISIS and they're terrorists, and that happens. This is a big problem because everything is couched in terms of propaganda. This was a report this morning that Iran has discovered a new oil field with estimated 53 billion barrels of oil. Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is going through this, what we would call this is Israel Hayom had a little editorial cartoon about the election merry-go-round in Israel. He appointed Naftali Bennett as the defense secretary this week. There's some talk about whether they would have a direct election running off between him and Danny Gantz to be the prime minister. That did happen once before in 1992, and it really had, it was the result on the effect on the parliament was pretty bad. So I don't know that they'll do that. Bringing Naftali Bennett into Likud, he joined the Likud party, and as a result of that, he was appointed as the defense minister in the caretaker government that Netanyahu heads up. Since he was the last prime minister, he continues in a caretaker role until a new government can be formed. By bringing his seats into Likud, that jumped Likud from 31 or 32 seats to 35, compared to Danny Gantz's 33. So now Netanyahu has the upper hand. But Lieberman is still saying, I'm not joining a government if the conservative religious parties are in it, and it looks, they've got about 2 weeks left until they'll be determining whether they'll go to another election. But Netanyahu addressed the Iran issue. I'll try to play this. I'm not sure if the video or the audio quality is good enough.
Iran has its aggression everywhere. It seeks to envelop Israel. It seeks to threaten Israel. It seeks to destroy Israel. We fight back. And I also want to say, given Iran's efforts to expand its nuclear weapons program, expand its enrichment of uranium through making atomic bombs, I repeat here once again, we will never let Iran develop nuclear weapons.
Because Israel views these things through the lens of people who went through this event, which we are celebrating the 71st anniversary, recognizing the 71st anniversary, 81st anniversary, of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass that happened in November 1938 in Germany. And here's a snippet of the front page of the New York Times on November 11th, 1938. Nazis smashed, loot, and burned Jewish shops and temples until Goebbels, whatever his name was, calls a halt to it. And here's a picture of, I'm not sure, the picture of the synagogue burning and that type of thing. So there were a lot of things this week about, is there a war looming between Israel and other people in the Middle East? For example, here is the thing called the Golden Report. When will Jerry Golden, when will the war begin? Published just yesterday. Israel's preparing for war with Iran and all its proxies, Hezbollah and all of Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Gaza, and very possibly Turkey. The answer to that question is when? The answer to the when question is when? Very soon. That is a lot of armies and air forces to fight at one time on many fronts for a small country like Israel. And one thing is certain, the longer it's put off, the stronger the enemies will become. Iran is now saying they can wipe Tel Aviv off the mat in less than 30 minutes, and their first target would be Kiryat in Tel Aviv, that is like the American Pentagon. That target alone would kill close to a third of the population. Israel is now putting into effect an emergency act code named Momentum to expand the missile defense capability. We can only pray and hope that they already have the anti-missile defenses in place. So these are people writing in Israel about what's going on. Iran's building bases everywhere across the Middle East. But, then he says this, war with Iran and its proxies is unavoidable, and the longer Iran is given to build the ring of fire around Israel, the worse it's going to be for Israel and the world. There's absolutely no doubt that all hell is about to break loose, not only in the Middle East, but globally. The world has gone completely insane and more anti-God every day. Sin rules supreme in most countries. There is absolutely no doubt, whoops, that's the same slide. So this is one of the reports. The other thing that's happening is Turkey. Now, Erdogan is supposed to be at the White House in a few days for a meeting with President Trump. Turkey says, look, we're trying to stop the terrorists, the YPG terrorists, and the Kurds are all terrorists, and they're awful, and we're just trying to help the world out with terrorists. Now, I saw a video. It was shocking. It was from one of the Turkish news outlets, and the person was going through one of the towns where Turkey had bombed and attacked to drive the Kurds out in northern Syria. And what happened was, he went by all of these shops that had been burned. It was clear that they had been bombed or whatever. And here's what the Turkish reporter said. Look at these shops. Look what the Kurds did to their own property. As they were leaving, they burned everything. They set up IEDs to blow these places up so that nobody could come in here and live after they left. It was such blatant propaganda. It was shocking. It was amazing. Now, when Erdogan was here back to visit President Trump back in 2017, he had a security detail. And this is a picture taken in Lafayette Park, and these are people that are pro-Turkish demonstrators. Erdogan had a security team. There were Kurdish demonstrators there protesting against Erdogan. We'll play you a video of what happened. The men in suits are Erdogan's security detail, and look what they did in the United States, in the shadow of the White House, against people that they didn't like what they were saying. You see what they're doing? So this goes on for a while. Now, as a result of that, 15 of the security detail people were indicted for crimes in federal court. To my knowledge, all of those were later dropped as probably sort of a, well, you know, we have a guy, when one of our diplomats was going to Turkey, they dismissed all these things. But these guys are thugs. This is Erdogan, and by the way, I could show you another part. This is Lafayette Square, right across from the White House, right next to the White House. And there are pictures where Erdogan is getting out of his limo in front of the White House, and you can see over his shoulder his security detail kicking the pro-Kurdish, anti-Turkey demonstrators in our country. On that visit, too, by the way, I believe Erdogan dedicated a huge mosque just outside of D.C., and this is what Turkey has been doing. They've built somewhere over 15,000 mosques around the world to put people in place. They have Turkish organizations in Germany and European countries, and they don't assimilate. And the word from Erdogan is, you go there and make babies. Because unlike America, we worry about what's going to happen in the news cycle by the end of the day. In Islamic countries, certainly Erdogan wants to be the new head of a caliphate. He wants to be the new caliph. But if he's not, he will do what he can to put it in place. Because he figured, well, it might take 200 or 300 years, but eventually it will come about. And we're worried about what's going to happen, you know, this week in Washington. So they have a much longer view of these things. Now, this is an article in the Jerusalem Post recently that Turkey protected Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS. And I'll play a little bit more. In fact, here's an example of what happens. This is sort of shows you the animosity between the Turks and the Kurds. This is a Kurdish lady. She's you're going to see her. She's elected to the Turkish parliament. This happened back in 1991, and she goes and she takes her oath of office. Watch what happens here. November 5th, 1991.
Devletin varlığı ve bağımsızlığını, vatanın ve milletin bölünmez milletin kayıtsız ve şartsız egemenliğini koruyacağıma ve temel hürriyetlerden yararlanması ve anayasa adamaktan ayrılmayacağıma büyük Türk milleti önünde namusu ve şerefine and içerim. Ve sonunda bu gele kurdu gele tıklar.
Burası burada Türk dilleri yazması. Burası nedir? Not dinleyeceksin.
Well, that went well, didn't it? She was charged with terrorism and sentenced to 15 years in prison. She was a member of parliament. So you need to understand the Turkish desire to control things and to ethnically cleanse the Middle East goes way back. This is another article from just a couple days ago in Foreign Policy magazine. Erdogan wants to redraw the Middle East ethnic map. And it talked about how the Armenian genocide happened, and the Armenians, a lot of those had to flee from Armenia, the Armenian genocide back in 1915. 1 or 2 million Armenians were slaughtered. Many of them were slaughtered as they were sort of forced to migrate someplace else. Hey, you need to get out of here, we'll protect you, don't worry about it. And then as they moved out, they were slaughtered on the way to wherever they were going, they thought they were going. So it just didn't happen in Turkey. And a lot of those Armenians, some of whom were Christians, ended up in Dar el-Zor in northeast Syria, where the oil fields are that the United States is now saying that they're going to protect, to allow the Kurds to sell the oil and fund defense operations. At least this is the most recent thing. But you need to understand that Erdogan is a jihadist. He wants to take over the Middle East. You may not remember this, but back in 2006, Pope Benedict the 16th triggered a global crisis with his September speech in Germany. His ill-considered, this is from a Spiegel, a German publication, his ill-considered comments on Islam and the story behind how he came to other them say a lot about how out of touch the Vatican really is. And in that speech, Benedict uttered these words, which were words spoken in 1391 by the Byzantine Emperor Manuel II to a Persian scholar. And Benedict quoted him, and he said, "Show me just what Muhammad brought that was new, and there you will find things only evil and inhuman, such as his command to spread by the sword the faith he preached." Now, listen, this just happened 13 years ago when Benedict had to walk it back. Well, now what do we have? We have a pope that's going to Abu Dhabi and signing interfaith, joint faith agreements with Islamic imams from Al-Azhar University, which is the largest Sunni university in the Middle East. So this is, again, I'm trying to present this in a logical fashion. It may seem like I'm skipping around a bit, but remember, this is the knotty problems that we have with the way things are unfolding in the world today, because it is very complicated. This, for example, is a map that was just published, the situation in Syria as of today. So when you look at the top of the map, you see the purple areas along the Turkey-Syria border. The bluish area is what is controlled by Turkey. That's about 160 miles or so wide. They want to control about 500-mile wide swath that would be represented by the two purple areas and the blue area. And from the blue area, several 100,000 Kurds have had to flee. It is a knotty problem, to say the least, as to what's going on there. You see Dar al-Zor down here a little bit below the upper black thing. Go straight down, you see Dar al-Zor. That's where some of the American troops still are. You see the Iraqi border to the right of the slide there, or the map, would be Mosul and Kirkuk. Kirkuk is the Kurdish capital. One of the people that I think I will give great credit to CBN, Eric Stakelback, Dalton Thomas, Joel Richardson, some other people that I think are really working hard to present the facts of what's actually going on in northern Syria in these Kurdish areas. There is no ceasefire. Close to 250 Kurdish civilians have been killed. Drones have attacked ambulances, rescuing people that have been injured. This is really contrary to all rules of warfare. Erdogan is using not really Turkish troops so much as jihadist thugs, like he would bring to Washington in a few days. So here's an interview with Eric Stakelback on The Watchman by CBN and Kufi, talking a little bit about what's going on in Iraq. This is about 4 or 5 minutes long, so I really want you to listen to this.
We are on the Iraq-Turkey border. First of all, what a view. This is absolutely stunning. But we're here for a reason. We have a not-so-pleasant actor right over the border here in Turkey, and President Erdogan. Give us your view of what's going on in the region.
The best way to explain it is by explaining the geography where we are right now. Just over these mountains here is the border of Iran, and just over these mountains here is the border of Turkey. And then if you drive a few hours, you're at the border of Syria, where now 8-year civil war is raging. And so you could say in many ways the Kurds are surrounded by jihad and by genocide. And if we look at the historical continuum of suffering that they've endured, you begin to ask the question, is their suffering finished, or will they face another round in the future? And I think in light of the Ayatollahs, I think in light of the Iranian regime and in light of the Turkish regime, these mountains here for the last number of years have been lit up with airstrikes on a weekly basis, indiscriminate airstrikes from the Turkish regime, shelling, artillery shelling in communities. And they're doing it in the name of fighting terror. But the reality is, I think Erdogan's regime is closer to actually being the manifestation of terror than the people that he's actually terrorizing. And so now Erdogan's saying we want to eliminate the terror corridor. What he means is we're going to eliminate the Kurdish forces that eliminated the terror corridor. What was the terror corridor? It was the Islamic State. It was
ISIS.
the caliphate.
Yeah.
And who aided and embedded and allowed their open border to sustain and nurture the Islamic State for the duration of its existence? And then the Kurds...
Turkey did. There was a free flow of foreign fighters from Europe, even the United States, transiting through Turkey into Syria and Iraq to join and fight with ISIS. And Erdogan looked the other way. The Turks looked the other way.
Absolutely. Tens of thousands of foreign fighters poured into Iraq and Syria. How'd they get in? They got in through Turkey. The wounded were brought out through Turkey. Funds were brought in through Turkey. Arms were brought in through Turkey. Turkey meddled with opposition forces that were trying to stem the flow of it, and Turkey got in the way of it. In many ways, Turkey was one of the greatest champions of the Islamic State. Yet they're a member of NATO. And you have the Kurdish forces that actually eliminated the territorial caliphate, and now Erdogan is attacking the forces that eliminated ISIS, which means it's pretty clear what's happening right now.
He's viciously anti-Israel, not very fond of the West either. Tell us more about Erdogan and why he is such a dangerous player here in the region.
There's a lot of reasons why he's a dangerous player, but he believes that he has this prophetic role to play as the leader, as the restorer of the caliphate.
The Ottoman Empire.
What we need to understand is that the caliphate, the Islamic empire that existed for over a millennium, was dismantled at the end of World War I. And he believes that it's the restoration of that empire. So even when he talks about Kurdistan, he's speaking about the territorial boundaries of the Ottoman Empire, of the Caliphate, and he believes it's his role to restore it to the glory days.
And so people at home understand, Turkey was the base, the headquarters of that Ottoman Empire, and Erdogan, it seems, Dalton, sees himself as the modern day, as you said, the modern day caliph or leader of what he believes will be a new caliphate.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's driven by the same, let's say, genocidal tendencies and ambitions as many before him, like Saddam Hussein. Now, Saddam Hussein committed genocide against the Kurds here. Approximately somewhere between 150 to 180,000 people were systematically targeted, ethnically cleansed, terrorized, killed, massacred, thrown into graves alive, chemical attacks. I mean, this was a decade-long systematic campaign to annihilate the Kurdish people that the only thing close to it is the kind of things that the Jewish people themselves have experienced, which is why there's this similar experience of the Jewish people and the Kurdish people. The genocides of the past point to the potential of a genocide in the future if we don't wake up and see what's actually happening and what's on the line. Because looking ahead and looking what's happening in these here mountains, there's some dark, heavy days coming, and I don't think the Western world is aware of it.
Now, to follow up on that, that was an interview just a day or two ago in Iraq. Michael Oren, the former ambassador to the United States of Israel, former Knesset member, wrote an article that was in Foreign Policy just last Monday, and it said, "The Coming Middle East Conflagration." Here are a couple quotes from that article. He said this: "The senior ministers of the Israeli government met twice last week to discuss the possibility of open war with Iran. The ministers also reviewed the recent attack by Iranian drones and cruise missiles on 2 Saudi oil installations, reportedly concluding that a similar assault could be mounted against Israel from Iraq." And this is an analysis. This is an analysis that was in the Jerusalem Post the other day about the fact that the lack of a new government being formed is causing problems. There are budgetary issues that need to be addressed. Israel has undertaken attacks. They have gone in and they've attacked, hundreds of attacks within Syria to prevent Iran from establishing their bases there. Here's what Orrin says in this article. With regard to how this war might begin, it's not hard to imagine how it might arrive. The conflagration, like so many in the Middle East, could be ignited by a single spark. Israeli fighter jets have already conducted hundreds of bombing raids against Iranian targets in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Preferring to deter rather than embarrass Tehran, Israel rarely comments on such actions. But perhaps Israel miscalculates, hitting a particularly sensitive target, or perhaps politicians cannot resist taking credit. The result could be a counterstrike by Iran using cruise missiles that penetrate Israeli air defenses and smash into targets like the Kira, Tel Aviv's equivalent of the Pentagon. Israel would retaliate massively against Hezbollah's headquarters in Beirut, as well as dozens of its emplacements along the Lebanese border, and then after a day of large-scale exchanges, the real war would begin. So this is something that might come up accidentally. He also notes this: precision-guided missiles, growing numbers of which are in Iranian arsenals, pose a far deadlier threat. Directed by joysticks, many can change destinations mid-flight. The David Sling system, developed in conjunction with the United States, can stop them in theory because it has never been tested in combat. And each of the interceptors costs $1 million. Even if it is not physically raised, Israel can be bled economically. But what if Israel needs more than that? What if there were a situation in which the survival of the Jewish state were threatened? Would the United States intervene? The answer is yes to agree, though the details remain. The United States is dearly committed to helping protect Israel's skies. Whether American troops will go on the offensive on Israel's behalf remains uncertain. That ambiguity is only deepening in an election year in which the incumbent and his opponents are campaigning to end the old Middle Eastern wars, not get bogged down in new ones. I was talking about the United States. Polls taken after the president's decision to withdraw from Syria show a lack of bipartisan support for even a small-scale American military involvement in the region. So this is a problem. And I'm just showing you all these different, from the International Policy Digest, a new Middle East is coming. They're talking about, well, what's this new Middle East going to look like in the future? Now, one of the things that somebody referenced, I thought this was an interesting map. This is Ralph Peters. You might see him, used to comment on Fox a lot. I don't watch Fox much anymore, so I don't know if he still comes. But when he was working with NATO back in 2006, they came up with these maps. Now, this is a map of the existing Middle East. What they did was they took the map and they said, well, how could NATO redraw the map? The way the map was drawn in the Sykes-Picot and Treaty of Lausanne and other agreements beginning in World War I and after really doesn't recognize the tribal and religious divide that exists in the Middle East. So is there a better way to create different countries? So they came up with this particular map, and you see they have an Arab Shia state that embraces Kuwait along the Persian Gulf, all the way down along Saudi Arabia, all the way down to the United Arab Emirates, and over into Iran. Then they have a new Persia, they have Sunni Iraq, and they also have a free Kurdistan. Do you see that up there near the top of the, up here, free Kurdistan. They also have an Islamic sacred state. Yemen grows a little bit. Oman is split up among a bunch of different countries. This is Qatar, by the way. I misspoke. This is Qatar. This is the United Arab Emirates, Dubai, and the magnificent cities that they've been able to build. This is sort of where the oil and gas deposits are. And you can see that a lot of those oil and gas deposits lie in what would be free Kurdistan and the Arab Shia state. And so there are these, all week long I was getting these articles. This is from Geopolitical Futures. How do we resolve the situation in Syria? And they said this, they noted that Russia doesn't really want to be there. They're not happy with Iran. Iran wants more. Turkey wants their piece. and everything is in a giant state of turmoil. One of the things I mentioned last week was the estimated cost of rebuilding Syria. I heard it initially when they were talking about it was $50 billion. And I'm like, the cities are devastated. Nobody can live there unless they're completely razed. Well, they're already pretty much knocked down. But Aleppo and other places, even massive portions of Damascus have been destroyed. $50 billion is nothing. Then I heard $250 billion. Now they're talking about $1 trillion. So the geopolitical futures article looks at it and says, okay, is this realistic? Is Syria ever going to be able to be rebuilt? Now, we know that in Bible prophecy it says that Damascus at some point will cease from being a city. So you figure if Damascus goes, Syria is probably going with it, right? So $1 trillion to rebuild Syria. In 2010, before the Syrian civil war started, the gross domestic product of Syria was, guess how much? $60 million. There's no way, and listen, Texas has a larger economy than Russia. So this is a pipe dream. This is going to be a conflict area until the world returns. Now, I will give credit to my friend Brian Schrager. He wrote an article about a Jewish museum in Tel Aviv that houses historical artifacts of Babylonian Jewry. And what happened, we know that after the 1948 war, Jews were essentially forced out of large portions of the Middle East. Today, if you went to Iran, you might find a couple dozen Jews in all of Iran. You probably wouldn't even find that many in Iraq or Syria. So they've established a museum. And Brian went to the museum. There's a good article that he wrote from Baghdad to Ben Gurion, The Return of Iraq's Jews and Why It Matters Today. And I just want to quote a little bit from Brian's article as he concludes there. And now I find that I don't have it sitting in front of me. I'll paraphrase. I thought I had copied the quote and pasted it in my slide. He essentially says this. What happened to the Jews and they're being forced out of the Middle East could potentially happen to Jews today and Christians. And we ought to learn the lessons of history. And I think that's what Brian has been talking about, what Dalton Thomas, Joel Richardson, others that are really looking at the Kurdish situation on a pretty deep level, is it's a picture of what could be the future that the church faces, and the Jewish state and Jews in Israel and worldwide face. We've had a pretty good run in the West, but I can show you example after example. We have evangelical leaders who are sort of walking away from evangelizing even Muslims, and they're adopting. They're sort of entering into these essentially what would be a fake peace agreement with them. Well, we just need to learn about them and love them and be neighborly. At some point, you need to confront them with the truth of the gospel. And so the lessons that are happening in the Kurdish regions of Iraq and Syria today, and Iran and Turkey, really carry a lot of weight to what may be the future that we're facing here as Christians in America. I showed you all of the free speech restrictions that are coming into place. So it could be tough. And I've become increasingly of the mind that I think we need to reorient our minds about persecution and how to deal with it and how to look at it. I remember a Muslim convert, and he essentially said this: listen, you people You want us to stay in our mosque and that type of thing. You American evangelicals, stop telling us to do that. You are robbing us of the joy of suffering for Jesus Christ. Now, that's an orientation that we have not had in the West for a long time. And as I think it was Pastor Mike said a number of years ago here in this pulpit, you fear the one. Don't fear the guy and his system that can kill you. Fear the one that can destroy both body and soul in hell. And remember that we all are to operate, whether it's persecution or whatever, to the glory of God. So I'll close with this verse from 1 Corinthians 15, one of my favorite of all times. But thanks be to God, which giveth us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Father, I pray that you will help us to keep these verses in mind this week, and that we will always be ready to give an answer for the hope that lies within us and to share with people the gospel of Jesus Christ. Bless us this week in Jesus' name. Amen.